Good day guys, I'm Mini War Painter. In this video I'm taking my multi-tone base coat practice to the next level as I attempt to paint the best part of the colour wheel on the smoke that's coming out of my Exalted Sorcerer's arse. I'll catch you after the intro. Before we begin, I just want to give you a quick run through on what wet blending really is, because it's going to be the technique I'll be applying to lay down the foundation of my multi-tone base coat. Wet blending is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's blending two tones of colours together on the model whilst the paint is still wet, almost as if you're using the model as a palette. Wet blending is a quick and efficient method to creating smooth transitions. With this technique you could achieve blended tones on your minis within seconds, but a couple of things to be aware of before attempting. First of all, you'll want a wet palette. If you need more information on what a wet palette really is, check out my video on Model 1 Part 2, The Cape, where I explain the wet palettes a little bit more in depth. In order for this technique to work, you'll need multiple tones ready to go on your palette, so you can dip and dive into each one as and when you need to in order to maintain control of the blend. The last thing you want is for your paint to keep drying up, hence the wet palette. Another thing you need to know, funny little thing, is that this technique takes practice to get good at. Ironically, take your time with it. Don't rush yourself because you may find you'll only make the job worse. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Speed will come along on its own. Finally, if you're a beginner, this technique is more suited for large flat areas rather than tight, fiddly ones. However, if you want the job done quick, possibly because you're batch painting, then wet blending is the one you want. Now let's get on with some painting. Part 5. The smoke. So here's where I am at the moment with the Exalted Sorcerer. Pretty much completed except for his arm and stave. His feet I painted to resemble that of the feet I found belonging to an eagle. I based them with Averlund Sunset and washed with Yriel Flesh Shade and glazed up through Yriel Yellow and Pallid Witch Flesh. The yellow works brilliant here as yellow and purple are both complementing colours. As for the smoke, I visualised the colours used to paint warp flames, only this time I wanted to build up my own glazes rather than using the Citadel glaze range. So let's get to it. I began with basing the tip of the flame with Averlund Sunset, but because I'm planning to wet blend, I didn't need to waste time and effort with basing the whole of the flame, but rather just enough so I can overlap two tones together. With that based, I'm now going to block in with Warpstone Glow. And now it's time to get technical. So to wet blend, you're going to have to be fast whipping between your different tones in order to slap the paint on the model before the previous tone dries. So with developing gradual mixtures of my two base tones, I'll begin my wet blend process. Notice the direction I'm stroking the brush. I'll aim to manipulate the pigment towards the tone that's more dominating in the mixture. And that's the first wet blend process completed, and the finish is really smooth. This technique is really easy to do, and it just requires a bit of practice. Next, I'll block in the blue segment with Ahrman Blue. I want these tones to be rich in colour, so I chose Ahrman Blue because not only is it nice and vibrant, but it also ties into the armour. With that blocked in, I can tell already this will be quick to blend in with the green because already it's looking like it ties in well with the green already. But same again as last time, I'm going to make small pockets of mixtures varying each tone's intensity and begin wet blending these in, stroking the brush in the direction of the most dominating tone within the mix. Then finally, to finish off the multi-tone base coat effect, I'm going to finish things off with Naggaroth Night. This colour was perfect, as not only does it tail onto blue in the colour wheel, it also just happens to be the tone I've used to tail off the cape. And that's the multi-tone base coat completed. Next, I'm going to go through each different tone and apply shadowing and highlights. So after a while of thinking things through and getting a headache, I started shading down the yellow flame with Troll Slayer Orange. This is now applied as a glaze rather than a wet blend. I aim to apply this glaze to all the deeper ripples of the flames, manipulating the pigment to the more deeper sections of these ripples. This is then followed by a glaze of Army Painter Dragon Red. This is further applied to the deeper sections of the ripples, providing the area more depth for the viewer. Moving on to highlights, I begin this process with glazing Yriel Yellow along the higher edges of each ripple in the flame. Next, it's another glaze but with a 1:1 mix of Yriel Yellow and Pallid Witch Flesh. Then, to finish the yellows off completely, it's a final spot highlight of Pallid Witch Flesh. This highlight is to be applied very sparingly in order to avoid overpowering the yellow with such an off-white tone. And that's the yellow section completed. Moving onwards now, I had a little play with my wet palette to work out how I'd approach the green areas. My first idea was mixing some of the yellow base coat, Averlund Sunset, with the Warpstone Glow. This was a terrible idea, so I then tried mixing the shading tone of the yellow, Troll Slayer Orange, into Warpstone Glow. And again it was a fail. So in the end I had a light bulb. What if I used the previous base coat to shade and the following base coat to highlight? So with Averlund Sunset I started shading the green areas. This idea in the end was brilliant. The yellow tones tied in brilliantly with the greens, and it set the tone change up nicely as it blended into the yellow tones. I then mixed Baharroth Blue with Warpstone Glow to begin glazing in my highlights. I thought if the yellows worked as my shade, then possibly the blues would work as my highlights. So I went with Baharroth Blue rather than Ahrman Blue because I really wanted to use its bright, vibrant properties on the smoke at some stage. And since I'm not highlighting the blue anymore with blue, I felt it better used for the green areas, and I wasn't wrong. After being 100% satisfied with how that turned out, I reenacted the process again with the rest of the tones, using Warpstone Glow to shade the blue areas. Once completed, I was left with another wet palette conundrum. I didn't have the shades of purple that I pictured in my head that would work, so I mixed Dragon Red into Naggaroth Night to see if I could replicate my ideas. Once satisfied, I began mixing in some Ahrman Blue in order to begin glazing in my highlights. I felt, however, that this tone was a bit too dark, so I mixed in some Baharroth Blue to help brighten things up a bit. With that now completed, I was left with a nice blue highlight with a purple tint to it. Now let's move on to the last tone, the purples. I started off this process with shading in some of the Dragon Red and Naggaroth Night mixture I made to highlight the blues. It then dawned on me that I'd fudged up, as my current formula for shading and highlighting was to use the previous base tone to shade with and the following base tone to highlight. So I went back over these recesses with Ahrman Blue. Moving on to highlighting, the next colour up from purple on the colour wheel is red. So I began mixing in some Dragon Red into Naggaroth Night to begin my purple highlights. And that's the smoke completed. What a rush. I've really enjoyed this challenge of working with so many tones. I've definitely learned a significant amount from attempting this effect. The way colour mixing works in my head, and most of you will see it differently no doubt. In fact, some of you may well point and laugh and call me an idiot afterwards. But the thought process of mixing colours to suit one another is a bit like algebra. If A equals green and B equals yellow, then I need A and B to make the mixture that ties them together. And I think if you thought of it in more complex ways, by introducing multiple tones, then I think there's possibly formulas you could think long and hard about to make suitable tones compatible with your base tones. Anyway, rant over. I hope you guys learned something from this video. Let me know what your thought process is like when mixing colours. Thanks for watching guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you've anything to add, please don't hesitate to comment down below. If you're on Instagram, you can find me at miniwar_painter. Here you can follow my progression as I like to post regularly on my stories. Don't forget to subscribe and don't be shy to mix those paints. Ta-ra!